Hey, well, what's up, guys? Welcome back to the Collision Live. Daniel here, as always, joined at the desk by the best of times to my worst of times, Mr. Samuel David Camp.
Well, it's always a pleasure to be with you, Daniel.
Yeah, and you.
Happy to be the best of times in this duo.
Yeah, I'm clearly. I know my place. But you excited to talk some pop culture?
Definitely.
Well, you're in luck because that's what we do here every week, every Tuesday at 12, live on Facebook and YouTube.
You don't say.
Don't say. Breaking down kind of what's going on in culture, controversy stories, and kind of what it means as a Christian to engage with these issues. Think deeper. Doesn't mean we always have all the answers, but trying to ask good questions and go deeper than into some of these often complex issues. So yeah, if you guys are joining us live, we'd love to have you guys join the discussion as well. Let us know your thoughts. Let us know why Sam's wrong. If you have a different perspective than we do, again, we just love to break that down.
I'll happily ignore your comments.
Yeah, and we'll ban you from the page. Just kidding. But so yeah, I think we have a couple kind of interesting stuff this week. Kind of a more general topic, and then kind of one that's been making the news headline rounds on social media. And again, it's actually, in some ways, this is an old controversy that just has remained a controversy.
Yeah.
And that's with The Simpsons. Again, that shouldn't be maybe a big shock that The Simpsons is causing controversy. They've been doing that
Since its inception.
yeah, for what, 30 years? I don't know how long The Simpsons has
30
been.
years?
It must be
been around
approaching. Yeah, I remember as a kid, knowing The Simpsons. We weren't watching it in our house, but this particular controversy centers around the character of Apu, who is an Indian immigrant in the show. That he runs a convenience store, obviously leaning into a lot of the stereotypes and for better or worse, and kind of as our culture has changed and some of our priorities, some of the ways we understand stereotypes and racial issues. This character, who's been in the show for a long time, has become increasingly kind of a lightning rod for controversy. There was a documentary that was made a couple years ago that kind of broke down why this is an offensive character and needs to change. So again, this has been going on. The show addressed it, I think, in like 2018. So it's been an ongoing thing. But it's kind of returned to the news lately as the guy, a white guy that's voicing this character, that has been voicing it since the inception, has decided to step down from voicing the character, give the role to a person of color, and kind of going even a step further than that. He's sort of on the apology tour of, he said in one of his interviews, I think with Colbert, the late night show, about how he wants to go around and apologize to every Indian person in America for this portrayal. And again, these sort of stories aren't necessarily new. You sort of see a lot of these things happening. But again, I think there's some interesting and some important kind of layers to this, different angles that we can kind of break down. That I think it's definitely a conversation that Christians should be engaged with, and at least thinking kind of deeper than just throwing our hands up and our culture, here we go again. But why don't you get us into what are your as you're kind of looking into this story?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think for one, I think it just brings up the role of stereotypes, and what is the role of stereotypes in storytelling and media. I think obviously all stereotypes maybe begin with a grain of truth, and so there's otherwise it wouldn't be a stereotype, right?
It doesn't work if there's not some
if it has no relation to whatever it is you're stereotyping. And I think in this case, I think as times have changed, and I think as people have become just more aware of the harmful effects of stereotypes, I think you see, perhaps rightly, that the guy who's voicing the character sort of is kind of seeing how how his involvement in that has perhaps been problematic. But I also think perhaps the good that can come from this is more diverse people getting into voiceover acting, and I think that can be a good thing. I don't know, it's tricky because I don't think that he was coming at it from obviously not a malicious way, and I think for a lot of these you have to look at intent with what was his intention with this character. Is he like, is the voice character the one to blame, or is it really the writers? Like,
Yeah.
because he's not.
Or even just sort of I think you were saying kind of like the intent or the function. Because one of the things for me is like, this, if you kind of look at like and there's been some kind of conflicting stories and interviews, but kind of the main stuff that I've seen is like when they were coming up with this character, they basically asked him to do your most offensive, stereotype. Like the point of these characters, again, almost every character on The Simpsons. I'm not a big Simpsons fan by any means, but is a it's embellished.
A show of stereotypes.
It's not like an unintentional like, oh, we just didn't know. Like they're leaning in to be offensive. I think that the reason, in some ways, it's more problematic today is that some of that sort of offensive comedy just doesn't fly as much as it used to.
Yeah.
Like I think the whole role of stereotypes and the whole discussion in some way, we sort of our catchphrase here, we keep saying, don't be reductionist. We tend to kind of come down on, like it's very rare that you can kind of talk about an issue in just very sweeping, one size fits all. Because again, I think stereotypes are harmful. And one of the things I didn't realize about the character, since I'm not a big Simpsons fan, is that, for a long period of time, this is the only character in that kind of ethnic group on TV. Like there just wasn't any other representation, which is sort of, I think, why some people saw it as problematic. Is it's not balanced by all you have is this sort of very extreme kind of stereotype presentation. You don't have normal presentations that maybe it's more of an issue. But again, there's you get the expected kind of two sides with the story like this. It's on the one side, it's very much any kind of stereotype. No comedy can, be so insensitive or offensive. We can't have this kind of stuff. It's so harmful, and kind of this war against kind of the freedom of comedy. But then you also have the other side of sort of, oh, here we go again. There's another cancel culture. Everyone's so sensitive, and what do we do with that? 'Cause I think, I feel like in some ways, people, it's easy to say that when you're not in the group. That's
sure.
Yeah,
and I think, and you mentioned this earlier, but, I think Christians have been outraged about Christian stereotypes in pop culture since the beginning of pop culture, probably. And so, I think just being aware of like what a stereotype is, what's its function within the story. I think, I don't know, it's tough to say, because I think for one, I think it would be helpful to be a little more self-aware, whatever the stereotype is. So just to be more self-aware in general, whether you're being stereotyped or, somebody else is being stereotyped. But yeah, I think comedy is one area, and then I think it's separate from other types of storytelling, I think, especially when it comes to stereotypes or satire, that kind of thing. I think it is somewhat of a separate category than just like, a TV drama.
Yeah, because that's one of the things.
And you throw in like some just real stereotypical X, and it's like, okay, well that seems strange. But if you have a comedy TV show that's nothing but stereotypes of all types, that seems a little bit different to me.
Yeah, because I know like kind of a related story that's been going around is I can't recall his name, the Asian male actor from Lost, which is the greatest television show that has ever been created.
It's quite good.
He had been sharing some kind of reflecting on that role and saying like in the pilot he was very troubled about playing this because he felt like the dynamics of the marriage in that show was kind of this feeding into this stereotypical understanding of sort of the real dominant male husband and the very submissive wife and all this stuff. And I feel like that is, like you were saying, that's different. I think that is a danger that it's just sort of again, the show ended up unfolding very differently than that. That's kind of like a lazy, just sort of, you're just falling into it. You're sort of pushing it, kind of sharing it on, which is different than like, hey, this is offensive. That's the point. Again, it doesn't necessarily mean that everyone's going to find that funny. But kind of and you kind of alluded to it too. I think one of the things to you, like yours, to be kind of self-aware as far as like, it's not. Sometimes there's sort of the response of like, well, hey, it's this comedy, like that should be the place where anything goes.
Yeah.
But I think comedy does change. Like, I think if you've ever, like I've tried to show some of my kids like even like the old Looney Tune cartoon or Mickey Mouse cartoons, or like, some of these old movies where it's like the whole premise is just like really making fun of and like bullying like people with mental disabilities, or like, obese people, or like things that were sort of funny back in the day. Now sort of where we are as a culture, it's like maybe I don't think that is. I don't find that as funny today as I did. So I think there is like we do adapt. Things aren't always funny. I think so. It's not just any kind of changing or adapting isn't necessarily just an example of culture gone off the rails.
Yeah, and I think culture changes. I think tastes change over time too, and so I think obviously comedy changes over time, and for the better and for the worse. But I think it's just it's an ever-changing thing, and so that's just kind of, you kind of have to just be aware of that and kind of roll with it as it changes. So
yeah, and that's kind of why when we've got into this in other episodes of the Closing Live, like it's you're playing on kind of an endless game if you're constantly going back and like hey 20 years ago we were saying things that don't seem acceptable today, and it's because it was 20 years ago. Things change. I think that's okay. But again, and we don't need to get into it now. We're curious to hear what you guys think too. But there is an element though of comedy kind of being stripped of, like, is a show like The Simpsons, does it still work if it sort of has this burden of responsibility to not step on any toes or not be outrageous or really poke fun at different segments of society? Like,
and then who decides like whose toes are okay to step on and then whose toes aren't, and then like it's just sort of a never-ending sort of like, so you're gonna make fun of this group but you're not gonna make fun of that group, and then it's like, okay, so that can handle it, and therefore you're saying that this group that you can't step on toes can handle it, so you're patronizing the group that you're protecting, and it's like, it gets in a really weird place pretty fast, I think, if you're like,
if you start kind of playing, like almost every depiction of like religion is always some crazy like snake singing cult kind of weird backwoods, like, and it's like that's a stereotype, but that, I guess if you start getting to the no stereotypes, you can't necessarily do that. So I do think we lose something with when we start kind of expecting that like stuff, that comedy that's supposed to be sort of exploring where the limits are, if we don't let them do that. But at the same time, I think we need to accept that we do change our tastes, and it's not necessarily just there goes our crazy political correct society again. We all have changed over time, and I think shows and media will continue to do so. But hey, let us know, especially if you if you fall into that ethnic category. Let us know. Again, we're not Indian immigrants, so we're curious to hear what you guys think as well. Kind of another, not necessarily a controversy, but kind of another staple. We got into one last week with like graven images and what do we do with that, and kind of another question that sort of comes up, maybe not like overtly phrased in this sort of discussion, but I think kind of implicitly with the way we talk about art and pop culture, is this sort of the idea of sort of genres, and are some genres of music, of art, of movies, in any of the artistic mediums, are some kind of more appropriate for Christians than others? And kind of the flip of that, are there some genres that are just sort of by their nature off limits from Christian, kind of evil? Like, what do you do with that? Again, you see that probably most like traditionally with like music, like hard rock and heavy metal, and some of those. You can maybe even put rap, some of the rap genres in there. Are just kind of throughout the last couple of decades have been seen by a lot of Christians as that sort of out of that sort of that's the devil's music. Why does the devil have all the good music? So what do we do with that? How do we kind of approach that? Like, does it matter? Is it just fair game? Do we need to be more critical than that?
Yeah, I mean, I I think there's a couple of sort of categories that I'd perhaps put this into. One would be sort of what's acceptable in like church services, or like what's expected in church services versus like what can you just enjoy for listening pleasure, I guess. And so, like, I don't know that, Norwegian death metal worship music is ever going to catch on in church much.
But has it been tried?
That's a good question. I'm sure you'll be the first to introduce it. So I think there's sort of that categorization, whereas like church music, I feel like has to have, just because of the nature of people who come to church, has to have somewhat of a broader appeal. So when you get into more niche genres, that's going to be tricky to try and implement in a church service. But I think most, especially genres of music, I think most genres would be okay for Christians. But I think, again, you have to look at it. Like, I think it varies person to person. And so,
and there's kind of, I think there's there's different layers to sort of to this question. One is this, are there genres this on their own full scale that are off limits? And then kind of the next question after that is, are there certain kind of uses or situations where this might be appropriate here but not there? And I think you kind of see that with all art. I think different musical genres are better suited for like a romantic love song and a screaming death metal style. Just doesn't that genre isn't that style isn't at least in my opinion kind of suited for that. Or I think even some kind of worshipful stuff, I don't think that's suited. I don't think that captures sort of the essence of it. But again, I think the broader discussion of just, are maybe another way to put the question is sort of like, on their own, are certain genres is sort of inherently evil or wrong, regardless of what you do with them. You can never kind of overcome like heavy metal, or rock and roll.
Well, I think as far as music goes, I can't think of one that would necessarily be like inherently evil and unredeemable. And so I think there are perhaps music genres that are traditionally more avant-garde and seen as more rebellious and are perhaps dominated by less Christian strands of humanity, and so maybe it's a harder hill to climb. But I don't think that a genre per se can be unredeemable. Now, when you get into like more visual arts, I think there's obviously some that aren't going to be suitable ever. But I think for music, I would say that pretty much anything. Nothing comes to mind that's like you just can't.
I would say even like with visual, I'm not sure that they're necessarily. I think like thematic elements. There are stuff that I think are off grounds for Christian. I don't know if like is abstract art evil on its own? Is representation? I don't know if any specific genre is necessarily. And I think like you said, I think all genres come from somewhere. So they have some kind of connotations, like the sex, drugs, rock and roll. That's sort of where that came from. So they have those connotations. But sort of the question is like, if you kind of remove just sort of the origins or the genesis of the genre, is there anything inherently sinful about like a distorted guitar or fast-paced drums or a shredding guitar solo? And I'm not sure that you can make that case. I don't think you could say that genre has traditionally been used in a lot of ways that are sort of leaning into the satanic roots or blasphemy, but the genre itself kind of things are neutral. And the verse that I kind of thought of, again, it's not talking about the exact same thing, but I think it's a parallel, is in 1 Corinthians 8, where Paul's talking about counseling the Corinthians about eating meat that had been kind of used to give to idols. And people were feeling kind of uncomfortable with that, or some of them were, and some of them were okay, saying, hey, it's just meat. And the other people are like, no, this has a dark kind of connotation. This is sort of reflecting where we were, where we don't want to go back to. And I think kind of Paul's way of wading through that issue is kind of, it informs us for genres, where he's basically saying, hey, like things are just things. Like, things, like a slab of meat is not evil or sinful or good. It's meat. I think kind of the parallel is like music, like a distorted guitar or a rap genre or whatever, on their own.
Synthetic beats.
Yeah, synthetic. Well, that's questionable. But some of that, this is stuff like, if that causes you to, if that impacts your relationship to God or brings you to a darker place or tears you down or causes you to sin, then it's wrong for you. But if it doesn't, if that's not impacting you, then it's not sinful on its own.
Yeah. And I think, I think where it comes down to sort of the personal is, for a lot of folks before they came to the Lord, perhaps they're like heavily involved in, let's say heavy metal and, heavy drug use, and they just had a very worldly life. And so they come to the Lord and they just want to put away all of that because they just can't disassociate it from their past life. And so for those people, I think a lot of times, you see them sort of crusading sometimes for everyone else who maybe didn't have the same background that they did, saying, hey, you should not listen to this music because it's, it's evil, or it's going to lead you to a bad place because they were in a bad place when that's what they listened to. And so I think that's where you can get into the saying, just being careful, not to necessarily promote music when that if you've got, a fellow believer who has worked hard to kind of get rid of all of that in their past, and so it just has super negative connotations for them. But that also doesn't mean that it just because you have a bad history with let's say a particular genre or a particular band or whatever, that doesn't mean that everyone else carries that as well. And so I think that's where some of this tension comes from.
It's probably not surprising that I feel like for probably all of us, if we're honest, like I feel like what we would say is sort of the most appropriate Christian expressions through art or music tends to be exactly what, the Venn diagrams is like a circle of what we like and what we grew up with. Yeah. Like you see that with like in church, like hymns and stuff, people push back about that, but like we don't sing Gregorian chant in church anymore. Like, there was a time when the acceptable genre of music was kind of overthrown and hymns became the norm, and like that's just sort of how kind of art history has worked. It's always evolving and changing and kind of adapting and exploring new grounds. Again, like every person tends to see new stuff coming in as like a threat to the established. Where I think again you see this again, maybe not like people don't necessarily think about it explicitly, but like a lot of Christians are feel kind of queasy about like horror, like as a genre of literature or movies, as somehow like the horror genre on its own is satanic, just because it's been used to delve into some of that, or rock and roll and all that kind of stuff. Is that there are genre, like if you go to like a Christian bookstore, I know there's fewer and fewer of those. If you go to like the literature, like the book section, like you only find like about two. You find like kind of allegorical stuff, and you find like romance, and that's about all. Like you don't get a whole lot of other genres. And I think it's a question that Christians should wrestle with a bit, as far as like, can a genre, again, I think there's different uses and situations where things doesn't necessarily mean that a genre is appropriate to use anywhere. But yeah, I think as Christians, we have the freedom to, basically all of this is my defense to justify my insane and unhealthy obsession and collection of heavy metal music.
Well, it's not to say that, like, I think most genres can be redeemed in some way, and I think you're seeing that even in the like Christian music of today. Like there's a lot of like Christian rap or Christian metal or whatever. So like I think there's whether or not that's good for us or that's another conversation. But I think like just because it's in a particular genre doesn't mean that it can't be redeemed in some way.
Yeah, and again, that's sort of the story in philosophy. It's called the genetic fallacy, where you sort of judge something today based on the roots, even if it's very different. That's sort of what happens like Halloween or some of these holidays.
Yeah.
But again, I think the story of Christianity, anyone that has a cross on their wall or on their necklace is wearing an instrument of violent death.
Torture. Yeah.
Yeah. The story of Christianity is sort of redeeming.
Bunch of goths.
Yeah. Redeeming things from kind of pagan or satanic roots and kind of using them to glorify God. Yeah. So I think that's a good guiding principle for us. So this week at The Collision, encourage you guys to check out last week. We had a conversation about literature, books, fiction, why Christians should read more of it. If that was sort of the appetizer before the meal, if you want the meat, you want the real thing, I encourage you to check out thecollision.org. I posted an article just the other day, kind of getting into more detail with that and kind of more systematic as far as like, hey, what is the value of Christians reading fiction? How can it actually fill a very needed void in our lives? So encourage you to check that out. And then if you enjoy it or if you don't enjoy it or disagree, let me know in the comments. And again, it's something I never tired of talking about books and literature because I'm a literary nerd. But cultural observation, anything kind of crazy, interesting you see going on?
Nothing too crazy. Just perhaps another Marvel thing came out that I may or may not see. It's just tough to keep up with.
Yeah, I know. What it has a big title. Again, we still haven't got the Winter Soldier, Winter Falcon Soldier. We still haven't got that title right yet, in however many episodes. But again, yeah, I've seen a lot of people excited about this new Marvel show. I'm way behind on the Marvel shows. But again, I'm excited that the big Marvel fans are getting a steady drip diet of content.
Yeah, but that's. Yeah, I don't really have much else other than that. What about you?
A couple kind of interesting things. I saw they announced they're making a second Downton Abbey movie.
Sign me up.
So we will, some of that British escapism. I think is maybe the second review we ever did on our YouTube channel. Was my sister took me to the theaters to watch the first Downton Abbey movie, having never seen any episodes of the show. And again, I enjoyed it, so I will be looking forward to that. Another kind of just fun fact. I had my Van Gogh fact the other day that today, 180 years ago, Mr. Edgar Allan Poe, as a young writer, published the first ever detective story. Oh, wow. I know he doesn't get credit for inventing that genre. We associate that with Sherlock Holmes and Conan Doyle and Agatha Christie. But this is sort of considered the first.
I didn't know that either.
The first kind of he had several other short stories. I think he had 3 or 4 of these. Dupin was his detective. Again, he's Poe, so it's a very strange story. But hey, give our boy Poe some credit.
He does more than quoth the Raven.
Apparently. And one last thing that I thought was humorous is that I saw a headline that Nintendo was suing Bowser. So of course, being who I am, I investigated further. Apparently, there's some hacker group, something that I don't know all the details of it, but the guy goes by the name of Bowser. So technically there will be a court case where Nintendo is suing Bowser.
That's pretty funny.
Which adds to the humor of, if you guys didn't realize, the new president in Nintendo America, his name is Doug Bowser. So like the president of Nintendo is Mr. Bowser.
That's next level there.
Yeah, and that's like my doctor back in the day, Doctor. He was destined to do that. So again, there's always fun quirks going on in pop culture. Anything else for?
I think that's it.
Yeah, well, thanks guys for checking us out. I hope you'll join us again every Tuesday at 12 Eastern time on our Facebook, on our YouTube. Make sure you subscribe to our channel, like our page. Join us next week. Let us know some comments if you're watching this back at a later time. Guys, stay safe out there. Have a great week and continue to collide with the world for Christ.